The ceasefire signal had been broadcasting for 4 minutes when Admiral Gwen Hooper pulled me out of the cargo bay. She did not explain. She did not have time to explain. And I did not have standing to ask, because I was a retired treaty law professor who had been hiding in that converted cargo bay for 22 days, and the last time anyone had asked my opinion about anything of consequence, humanity still had 400 warships in its outer fleet. That was 18 months ago. We had 14 now. Hooper pressed a folded paper into my hand in the corridor and said 2 things. "You speak Keth," and "Get in there." That was my promotion. That was my entire briefing. I had not been issued a uniform. I had not been given a rank or a title or a set of instructions beyond those 7 words. So I folded the paper, put it in my jacket pocket, and followed her onto the bridge of the carrier Aldrich, which was running on emergency power and smelled of recycled air and the metallic edge of overtaxed cooling systems. My name is Mara Voss. I am 51 years old. I have never fired a weapon. I have never given a military order in my life. What I have done, for the past 30 years, is read documents that other people found too tedious to finish. I wrote a doctoral thesis on the interstellar compact of Keth-Sol relations. I taught interstellar treaty law for 6 years at a university that does not exist anymore, not because it was destroyed, but because its entire administrative structure dissolved when Earth's Coordination Office began emergency consolidation in the 4th month of the conflict, pulling every institutional resource into the war effort and leaving places like universities to manage their own continuity, which they could not. I had published 9 papers in my field, each of which had been read by, at most, a few dozen specialists, in a discipline that most people had never heard of and would have had difficulty describing if pressed. None of this made me qualified for what was about to happen. What made me qualified, the only thing, was that I spoke Keth fluently. Not natively because I had started learning it at 32, which is far too late to acquire a tonal language without accent, but fluently. I had worked at it for 19 years because the language was beautiful, and because understanding the compact required reading it in the original, and because I am the kind of person who, when they need to read something in a language they do not speak, learns the language, rather than settling for a translation. That quality, the inability to settle for a translation, the insistence on going to the source, was the only reason I was on that bridge. The tactical display on the main screen showed the map of human-controlled space in 2 colors. Blue was what we held. Red was what we had lost. I stood beside Hooper and I looked at the map and I counted the red zones because counting is how I manage the distance between what I know and what I need to know. I counted 23 colony systems gone dark. I counted 4 major transit hubs lost. I counted Colony World Brennan, which I had visited in my 2nd year as a junior diplomatic attaché, and where I had eaten the best meal of my professional life in a restaurant run by a couple who had emigrated from the Mars settlements and who made a soup from hydroponic ingredients that tasted somehow of a kitchen on Earth, even though neither of them had been to Earth in 8 years. Brennan was red. I counted Callaway Station, the first deep space refueling hub humanity had ever built beyond the gas giants. The place where the engineering team that designed it had celebrated by having dinner in their pressure suits, because the interior wasn't pressurized yet, and they couldn't wait. Red. I counted New Lisbon on the 2nd moon of Kepler 442b, where I had given a lecture on treaty frameworks to 14 people, and a maintenance robot that had wandered in from the corridor and spent the full hour in the back row before quietly leaving. Red. The Dominion had not needed to fight hard for most of those places. That was the thing I kept returning to, standing on the bridge and looking at the map. They had not fought hard because they had not needed to. The strategy was older and simpler and more effective than open conflict. You move in, you cut communications, you establish authority at the perimeter, and then you wait. Because a colony that cannot resupply will not hold, and a colony that cannot call for help will not be helped, and patience costs nothing to the side that has already won the larger engagement. The Dominion had done this before. They had done it 17 times in the past 4 centuries, each time with a different species, and each time the species in question had eventually reached the same conclusion. Hold out if you want to, but the math only goes one way. 14 warships had survived the 18-month conflict. 422 had gone in. The Dominion's losses, by our best available intelligence estimate, numbered between 9 and 12 vessels, and even that figure felt generous to us because we had been inside the conflict and had a natural tendency to hope our damage was greater than our information could confirm. They had not fought us hard. They had fought us enough. Enough to make the lesson clear. Enough to demonstrate the scale of the capability difference. And then, they had waited for us to run the numbers ourselves and request the ceasefire. Which we had done. Which was why I was on this bridge. The Dominion response appeared on the main screen in layers. Keth script first, then Galactic Standard, then English. The Dominion was always precise about translation, in the way that a power is precise when it wants you to understand that there is no room to claim you misread something. Grand Chancellor Vreth of the Keth Dominion accepted humanity's ceasefire request. He would receive one human representative aboard his flagship, the Eternal Compact, within 6 hours. That representative would come alone, unarmed, with no authority to negotiate. They would come only to receive the terms. The word the Keth text used was one I knew well from my years studying the language. In formal diplomatic contexts, it meant the acknowledgement of a reduction in standing, the kind of word you use when you are processing paperwork for something that has already been decided. Submission, Hooper said, reading the English translation. She said it once, the way you say a word that costs something to speak aloud. Then she said nothing else for a moment. The Keth term has a softer register, I said. More procedural, more like formal acknowledgement of revised standing. She looked at me. She was 41 years old, and she had the face of someone who had made a decision already and was living through the time between making it and arriving at the moment where the decision becomes real. She had a sealed medical cut on her jaw from a console that had blown in a pressure event 4 days ago. The adhesive was starting to peel at the edge. "Does it?" she said. "No," I said. "Not really." She looked at me for a moment longer. "Bay 4, 6 hours. Take what you need." I went to my quarters, a cot and a footlocker in a converted storage room that smelled of machine oil from whatever the room had been used for before. I packed a change of clothes. I packed my identification documents. I packed my tablet, and then I opened the footlocker and I took out the book. It was a physical printed book, dark gray cover, spine cracked at the top from years of use. The corners of the cover worn soft. The Interstellar Compact of Keth-Sol Relations, printed in English and Keth on facing pages. First published in the 3rd year of contact between humanity and the Dominion, 83 years ago. I had carried it for 11 years. Through 3 postings, 2 apartments, a research fellowship, and now a converted storage room on a carrier running on emergency power. I had carried it the way you carry something you worked hard on. Not because you expect to use it, but because it is part of the architecture of who you are, and you do not put that kind of thing down. I put it in my bag. I told myself it was habit. I told myself it was the sentimental attachment of someone who had spent a decade and a half making the compact the center of her professional life. I did not tell myself it was strategy, because I did not yet have a strategy. I had a feeling, which is a different and less reliable thing. The feeling of a thread not quite finished. The feeling of a question I had been carrying for years without knowing it was a question. The shuttle in Bay 4 was small and smelled of hydraulic fluid and old upholstery. I was the only passenger. I sat in the forward seat and opened the compact to page 1, and I began to read. I read for the first hour with the steady focus of someone returning to something familiar. I knew this document. I had taught it. I had written about it. I had quoted specific provisions in papers and lectures and panel discussions for 16 years. I knew the broad structure of it, the founding articles, the species rights provisions, the trade framework, the dispute resolution mechanism that everyone cited when they wanted to demonstrate that the compact had teeth. I knew all of that. What I did on that shuttle, for the first time in the history of my engagement with this document, was read the appendix, not skim it, not note that it existed and move on. Read it, word by word, definition by definition, following every cross-reference into the relevant article, checking every article against the definitions in the appendix to confirm I was reading the terms the way they were actually defined, rather than the way they were commonly understood. Most readers stop before the appendix. This is the fault of appendices in general. They are dense and technical, and exist in a different register from the document's main text, and they are placed at the back, which creates a psychological suggestion that they are supplementary rather than foundational. In law, appendices are never supplementary. Appendices are where definitions live, and definitions determine what everything else actually means. An hour before the Dominion flagship filled the forward window, I found it. Article 7, Subclause 14C. I read it once. I went to the appendix and checked the definition of the critical term in Subclause 14 SREC, which was a Keth legal term that had two possible translations, depending on whether you used the general diplomatic definition or the narrower treaty law definition. The two translations meant different things. The narrower one, which was the correct one in this specific context, based on the cross-reference indicated in a footnote that I had read, because I read footnotes, changed what the clause said in a way that was not dramatic and was not obvious and was absolutely determinative. I read subclause 14 plash, again with the correct definition in place. I read it a third time. Then I sat back and looked at the forward window. The Dominion flagship was not yet visible. Space was dark and full and patient in the way that space is, and the shuttle was very small in it, and I was very small in the shuttle. And what I had in my bag was a worn printed book, and what I had found in the book was a single clause in a subsection of an appendix. My hands were shaking. They had been shaking on and off for 3 weeks. I had stopped being embarrassed about it and accepted it as a condition of the period I was living through. I was frightened in the way that had become my ambient state. A deep, constant, almost structural fear that had settled into my bones sometime in the second week of the conflict and had not left. I was frightened, and I was alone, and I was 51 years old, and the most powerful political and military force in the known galaxy was expecting me to sign a document giving it authority over the species I belonged to. But under the fear, running alongside it, there was something else. Something I could not name precisely. The feeling of a card in your hand that no one at the table knows you are holding. The particular quiet that comes before you show it. The flagship appeared in the window. It was enormous. Dark and smooth and lit with the deep blue of Keth running lights. It was the kind of object that exists to make you understand who you are dealing with without a single word being spoken. It had no reason to be concerned about anything as small as a shuttle with one passenger inside. I closed the book. I put it back in my bag. I breathed. I watched the flagship grow. My hands were still shaking. That was fine. My hands could shake all they wanted. What was in my bag did not care about my hands. The shuttle docked. A Keth honor guard was waiting in the airlock. 4 of them, nearly 2.5 meters each, gray-blue in coloring, their secondary eyes catching the light in a ring around their heads. They looked at me with the patience of beings who are completely certain of something, not hostile, not cruel, simply sure. I nodded to them. I picked up my bag. I followed them into the ship. The Dominion thought they had won. They were right to think so. By every calculation they had made, by every number they had assembled, they had won cleanly and completely. They had counted the ships and the territory and the silence of 47 observer species, and they had found victory in every column. They had not included the appendix in their calculation. No one ever does. The grand chamber of the Eternal Compact had been designed by people who understood that architecture is a form of argument. Every measurement, every material, every angle of the space made the same case. That the beings who built it were not concerned about you, had never been concerned about you, and expected you to understand within the first few seconds of entering what your position in the world was relative to theirs. The ceiling was 40 meters of Keth obsidian glass, a material that catches ambient light and holds it for a moment before letting it drift across the walls in slow shifting patterns. The effect is beautiful and deliberate. The light moves around you constantly, which creates a subtle, persistent sense that the room is alive and paying attention, that you are being watched not just by the beings in it, but by the space itself. I had read about this design philosophy in a paper on Keth diplomatic architecture that I had assigned to students once, and I had thought it was interesting. Standing inside the chamber, I thought it was effective. The walls were hung with the formal seals of every species that had ever entered treaty relations with the Dominion. Dozens of them. Some were ancient, the pigments faded on the hanging materials, to colors that were barely visible. Marks of contact made in centuries before anyone currently living had been born. Some were recent enough that the materials still held their original brightness. Some belonged to species that had remained fully independent through their relationship with the Dominion. Some belonged to species whose independence now existed primarily in legal record, absorbed through processes that the Dominion characterized as integration, and that the history books written by people outside the Dominion characterized as something else. The seals of those species remained on the walls because the Dominion believed that continuity of recognition was a form of respect, and because removing them would have required an acknowledgement that something had been lost, which was not a form of acknowledgement the Dominion was in the habit of making. I counted 47 representatives in the chamber. 12 Keth officials occupied the central crescent table, a long, sweeping curve of polished stone that looked as though it had grown out of the floor rather than been placed on it, which was either an optical illusion or Keth craftsmanship of a kind I could not immediately explain. The other species occupied tiered galleries that ran the length of the walls on either side. The Suri, the Varik Collective, the Hellan families. 8 others whose seals I recognized from the walls. They were seated in the positions their diplomatic protocol ranks assigned them, arranged with the precision of a proceeding that had been planned in detail and was expected to proceed as planned. None of them were participants. They were witnesses. The distinction had been established before the chamber opened, and it had been established by the people who controlled the space, which meant it was not a distinction that was open to challenge. I was the only human in the room. I want to dwell on that for a moment, not because it made me feel small, though it did, objectively, in a way that was simply true and not worth denying, but because it was a choice that had been made. To send one person, and it was the right choice, and I want the record to be clear about why it was the right choice. One person with the right knowledge is more dangerous than a delegation with no knowledge, and a delegation would have added noise to a situation where I needed quiet. One person asks questions. A delegation has positions to defend. I had no position to defend. I had a bag with a book in it. Chancellor Vreth sat at the center point of the crescent table. He was older than the official records showed. The Keth share our reluctance to allow unflattering images to enter official documentation, and the images on record were from his earlier years, when his coloring had been the darker blue-gray of Keth middle age. He had moved toward silver now, and his movements had the particular deliberateness of someone who had long since stopped needing to hurry anything. His primary eyes found me the moment I entered the chamber. They found me, and they stayed on me as I crossed to my assigned chair, and his expression was the composed, practiced blankness of someone who has held power long enough to make their primary face into an instrument of neutrality. His left secondary eye moved once as I sat down. A small, quick, involuntary flicker. In Keth physiology, the secondary eyes are not under the same conscious control as the primary. They carry the responses that happen too fast and too deep to manage, the reflexes of genuine emotion, too brief to be read by someone who does not know what to look for. I knew what to look for. 19 years of studying the species made sure of that. The movement meant recalibration, mild surprise. Not the surprise of shock, the surprise of encountering something that did not match the expected model, and required the model to be quietly adjusted. I had surprised him by being who I was. A retired professor, alone, no uniform, carrying a canvas bag. Good. Let the model adjust. Let the question form, even if it was small. Small questions have a way of growing. There was a cup of ceremonial tea on the table before me. Dark, heavy, smelling of the mineral-rich water that the Keth prefer for ceremonial preparations. I drank it without hesitation, because hesitating over ceremonial tea is a signal, and I did not want to send any signals yet. It tasted like iron, and the particular bitterness of an occasion that has been formalized, which is a real taste, that formal occasions create in whatever you drink during them. Vreth spoke in the formal ceremonial register of Keth official proceedings. The translation receiver behind my ear was very good, and it rendered his words in a voice that was neutral and clear. Ambassador Voss, humanity has sent its representative. The Keth Dominion acknowledges the ceasefire and accepts the terms of your government's formal request for submission of authority. We proceed now to conclude the matter efficiently and with the dignity owed to all parties in a proceeding of this type. I noted the word efficiently. I noted the phrase, with the dignity owed to all parties, which was a standard diplomatic formulation and meant nothing in itself, but was intended to signal that this would be a proceeding conducted with appropriate ceremony. These were the words of a meeting that expected to run on a predetermined track. "Thank you, Chancellor," I said, in Keth. My accent was present. It always is, for a human who learned the language past the threshold age, and the tonal elements never quite settle the way they would in a native speaker's throat. But my vocabulary was precise, and my grammar was current. And I had made it my specific business over 19 years to know which words to use in which context, and which register to use in which kind of room. The shift in the chamber was small and immediate. I had learned to watch for it. The slight adjustment of posture, the fraction of a second where attention recalibrated. 2 officials at the table moved slightly. A third looked at Vreth before looking back at me. Vreth's left secondary eye moved again, this time alongside a very small contraction of the primary expression muscles that did not reach his face, but existed in the microstructure of his expression for approximately a quarter of a second before settling. I was speaking their language and they had not expected it. This was a small thing. It was not a strategy by itself. What it was, more precisely, was an invitation for them to look at me more carefully than they had been looking, and more careful attention is what I needed. The terms have been finalized and are not presented for amendment or negotiation, Vreth continued. The human home system will retain limited self-governance under a Dominion oversight structure to be established within 30 days. All colonial territories beyond the solar boundary will enter provisional Dominion administration. Human military assets will transfer to Dominion registry within 30 standard days of signature. Human faster-than-light navigation capability will be restricted to licensed commercial lanes registered through Dominion Transit Authority. These terms are complete. An aide placed the document before me. Dominion formal material, heavy and slightly textured. Keth text first. Galactic standard below. A long signature line with witness marks and date stamps, and the Council authentication seal. It was a document that had been prepared in advance and was ready to be signed, and everything about its presentation communicated that the preparation had been thorough, and the conclusion was already settled. I looked at it. I did not reach for the pen that had been placed beside it. "Chancellor," I said, "before we proceed to the signature portion of this proceeding, I have a question regarding the legal framework." The pause that followed was slightly shorter than it should have been. The appropriate response from a chancellor in full command of a formal proceeding, asked an unexpected question by the representative of the party being submitted, is a measured and deliberate acknowledgement, a pause of comfortable duration that communicates control of the room. The pause I received was shorter by perhaps a beat and a half. That was information. The question had arrived somewhere that required a response before it could be considered. "Ask," Vreth said. "The terms as presented. Are they being established as an originating instrument, or under the foundational framework of the interstellar compact of Keth-Sol relations?" A different quality of silence followed. Longer. 2 full seconds, during which I watched Vreth's legal official to his left, a younger male with the sharper coloring of Keth early middle age, perform the calculation of how to answer without committing to a position that might have consequences. "The compact," the official said, "is a historical document. The current situation supersedes its applicable frameworks. The present terms are an originating instrument." "Has the compact been formally terminated?" I asked. I kept my voice level and genuinely curious, the tone of someone seeking procedural clarity. Formal termination requires a specific process under council registration, and I want to be precise about the legal foundation of today's proceeding. 2.5 seconds. 2.5 seconds in a formal diplomatic chamber at a proceeding of this significance is a very long pause. I counted them. No formal termination has been registered with the Galactic Council Archive, the legal official said. He was using the careful precision of someone who has moved from explaining to being precise, because imprecision might cost something specific, and he has not yet identified what. Then the compact remains active and registered under Council authority, I said, which makes it the existing foundational framework governing the legal relationship between our species. No one answered. The silence was the answer, and the answer was yes, and yes was what I needed on the record. I reached into my bag. I took out the compact and placed it on the table next to the Dominion's document. The contrast was visible, and I did not try to soften it. The Dominion's document was fresh and formal, and printed on the quality of material that announces authority. My book was old and worn, and its cover was soft at the corners from more than a decade of being handled. It looked like something that had been carried a long distance and used hard, which was accurate. I found the page I had marked on the shuttle and looked up at Vreth. I would like to request a recess before the signature ceremony proceeds. On what basis? He said. Not a question, a statement, flat and directed. Article 12, Section 3 of the Galactic Diplomatic Protocol, I said, and I said it evenly, at a measured pace, the way I had practiced saying it on the shuttle. This provision grants any representative of a founding compact signatory a mandatory reflection period of no less than 12 standard hours prior to the ratification of any amendment to a founding compact to which that species is party. Humanity is a founding signatory of the Interstellar Compact of Keth-Sol Relations. The proceeding before us constitutes an amendment to that compact, specifically, an amendment to the status, standing, and sovereign rights of our signatory relationship as defined under the compact's own terms. I am entitled to 12 hours of reflection before signature. I am claiming that entitlement now, on the record, in this chamber, before these witnesses. I said the last sentence the way you say a thing, when you need it to be remembered exactly as you said it. Not raised, not dramatic, simply precise. The quality of silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before it. This was not the silence of ceremony. It was not the silence of a proceeding moving along its prepared track. It was the silence of a room in which the prepared track had just ended, and no one had yet identified where the new path went. Every representative in the gallery was still. I did not look at them directly because I did not want to signal anything by looking, but I was aware of them in the way you are aware of a room full of people when you have said something that all of them are processing simultaneously. Vreth looked at his legal team. Not a long look. Not a visible to everyone look. A brief, contained look that communicated something in the private language of people who have worked together in high-stakes rooms for a long time. Then he looked back at me. His primary face was still composed. His left secondary eye moved twice. Grant the recess, he said. I stood. I thanked him. I collected my book and my bag, and I walked out of that chamber without hurrying, because hurrying would have signaled something I did not want to signal. And I walked down the corridor with an honor guard that was now slightly more alert than it had been on the way in. And I went to my temporary quarters on a flagship that had been designed to hold prisoners and dignitaries and that was now, it appeared, holding something in between. I set my bag on the desk. I opened the compact. I started the work. The first hour I spent mapping the Arbiter Protocol forward, not just what it said, but what it connected to. A treaty clause is only as useful as the structure that supports it, and I needed to know whether the structure held before I committed to building on it. I started at subclause 14 sleaze, and followed every reference it contained into the main body of the document. Each article those references pointed to contained further references, and I followed those too, until I had built a complete map of how the protocol interconnected with the rest of the document. What I found, working through that map, was something I had not expected even after finding the protocol itself. The compact was not simply a document with an arbiter protocol buried in an appendix. The compact was a structure, a deliberate, carefully constructed legal architecture in which every element reinforced every other, and in which the protections that had been written in to appear generous were as permanent and binding as the restrictions that had been written in to be controlling. The Dominion had built the compact as a containment, a framework that would keep lesser species within defined parameters while appearing to offer them rights and protections, and they had done their work well. The containment was thorough and durable, and extraordinarily well connected, every provision tied to others. Every right came with corresponding obligations on both parties. Every protection was backed by enforcement mechanisms that required the participation of the full council to be set aside. You cannot build a structure that thorough and stand outside it yourself. The walls run in every direction, including the one you are standing on. Article 19A was the one that took my breath for a moment when I reached it. Military assets deployed against a species protected under the Arbiter Protocol had to be recalled from all occupied territories within 72 standard hours of invocation. Failure to do so was a compact violation. Compact violations triggered mandatory trade sanction proceedings from every other signatory. I sat with that for a moment. The Dominion had occupation forces on 23 colony worlds, all of them. If I invoked the protocol, the Dominion would have 72 hours to pull them back, or enter violation status. And entering violation status would trigger sanctions from 11 signatory species, some of whom had been looking for a justification to apply economic pressure to the Dominion for years. Article 31. The protocol could not be waived by the initiating party. The Dominion could not simply refuse it. Article 44. The exit provision. If the Dominion chose to leave the compact rather than honor the protocol, they surrendered all rights and privileges established under it. Preferential trade access with 11 species. Registered priority rights to 3 hyperlane nexus points, including the Veth Crossing, which I knew from diplomatic reading to handle approximately 40% of Dominion commercial transit, and the activation of defensive provisions on behalf of every species that had been subject to Dominion pressure in the preceding 4 decades. That list was not short. I had not done a formal count, but I knew it was not short. The compact was a cage. The Dominion had built it for us. They had built it for everyone smaller than them, and they had built it so well, so permanently, so interconnectedly, that the cage enclosed everyone inside it, including the builders. I slept for 4 hours. I woke up at what felt like very early morning, though time on a Keth ship is regulated by the ship's clock, rather than any external reference, and the ship's clock did not correspond to any human rhythm I was accustomed to. I drank something warm from the room's provision system. I made notes. I checked my notes against the document and corrected 2 places where my initial reading had been slightly imprecise, and precision was going to matter. Then I got dressed and I went back to the chamber, and the 47 representatives were in their positions, and the Dominion legal team was larger than it had been the day before. And I sat down, and I placed the compact on the table, and I said the words I had been preparing to say since the shuttle window. Under Article 7, Subclause 14 Sleece, of the Interstellar Compact of Kethsol Relations, the human government formally invokes the Arbiter Protocol. This invocation is effective immediately, is made on the record in this chamber before these witnesses, and requires no acknowledgement or acceptance from any other party to take effect. And then I waited, and the room was quiet in a way that was entirely different from all its previous qualities of quiet. And Chancellor Vreth's left secondary eye moved, and kept moving, and I sat very still and let it. What followed the invocation was not chaos. I want to be specific about that because the story I am telling could easily become a story about chaos, about the dramatic eruption of an unexpected development in a formal setting, about raised voices and overturned expectations. The reality was quieter, and in some ways more unsettling than chaos would have been. Because chaos is familiar, and what happened in that chamber was not familiar at all. What happened was that a room full of very capable beings all became very quiet and very still simultaneously. Vreth's face did not change. His composure held on his primary expression in the way that 30 years of holding power trains a person to hold things. But I was watching him carefully, and I had been watching him since I walked into the room, and I saw what happened underneath the primary expression. The left secondary eye moving again and again, 3 times in quick succession, and then the very small, barely visible contraction of the expression muscles around his primary eyes that did not surface as a visible expression, but existed in the substructure of his face for approximately 2 seconds before settling back. In Keth physiological terms, that combination meant something specific. It meant that the established model of the situation had just been revised, significantly and unexpectedly, and the revision had not yet produced a new stable model. In human terms, he did not know yet what this meant, and he was used to knowing what things meant. The legal official to his left leaned toward him and spoke in a low voice that I was close enough to partially hear. 3 terms: the word for verify, which I had expected, the word for foundational standing, which I had also expected, and a compound term that I had to reconstruct from context, because I only caught 2 of the 3 syllables. The compound translated, approximately, as operational validity in a dormant state, the specific legal question of whether a treaty provision that had never been used could still be considered fully operational. That was the argument they were going to attempt. They were going to argue that the protocol was dormant in a way that rendered it non-operational, that 83 years without invocation had changed its status from active to theoretical. I had prepared for this argument. I had the response drafted. Vreth looked at me. His primary face was still composed, but the quality of his attention had shifted. He was no longer looking at me as the representative of a defeated species arriving to fulfill an expected function. He was looking at me as a variable that had just introduced itself into an equation where it had not previously appeared. "The Arbiter Protocol," he said, his voice carrying the deliberate evenness of someone managing what they allow their tone to hold, "is a dormant provision. It has existed in the archive for the duration of the Compact's history and has never been invoked. Its history of invocation is not a condition of its operational status," I said. I kept my voice level and precise. The protocol is operational when the conditions specified in subclause 14 are present, and when it is invoked by a qualifying signatory. Article 7 does not require prior invocation, or a minimum period of active use to establish operational validity. It requires the specified conditions which are present, and valid invocation by a qualifying party, which I have made. I paused for exactly long enough to let the sentence finish in the air. The protocol is in effect. The legal official, the younger one, to Vreth's left, the one who had answered my questions earlier, leaned forward again. This time I could not hear what he said, but I watched his hands, which were doing something Keth hands do in formal discussions when the person speaking is making a point they consider important. A slow rotation of the secondary fingers, the ones closest to the palm, that is the Keth equivalent of a human tapping the table to emphasize a word. He was making a point to Vreth that he considered important. I could not hear the point, but I could see that it was being made with emphasis. Vreth processed it for a moment. Then he looked at me again. "Ambassador Voss," he said, "a legal mechanism is not a military one. It adjusts procedure. It does not change the strategic reality." "Perhaps not," I said. "I said it the way you say something when you are entirely certain of the contrary, but do not need to say so because the evidence is going to do the saying for you." I had learned this tone from a senior colleague who had been the best diplomatic negotiator I had ever worked with, and who had told me once, very early in my career, that the most powerful thing you can say in a room where you hold an advantage is the shortest possible sentence that acknowledges the other party's point, while leaving all doors open. "Perhaps not," said in the right register, at the right moment, in response to a statement about strategic reality, communicates something very specific. It communicates that you know something the other party does not yet know, and that the knowing is already in motion. Vreth called for the verification process. I was escorted from the chamber with considerably more ceremony than I had received on arrival, a senior protocol official accompanying me rather than an honor guard, a route that took me through corridors of better quality than the ones I had been walked through before. Small signals. The signals that spaces and escorts send when the situation has been reclassified, when the person being moved has become something other than what they were when they arrived. My temporary quarters were comfortable. I sat at the desk. I opened the tablet and I composed a legal memorandum for Admiral Hooper that went through the entire case. Every provision, every cross-reference, every interaction between articles, every consequence of each possible path the Dominion might take. I was thorough. I was more thorough than I needed to be for a single communication, because I was also using the act of writing the memo to test my own analysis, to see if there were gaps I had not noticed, flaws in the structure I had built, places where the argument did not hold the way I believed it held. I did not find any. That was not arrogance. That was the result of having read the document carefully enough to know what it said, rather than what I wanted it to say. The two are different, and keeping them different is the most important discipline in legal analysis. I transmitted the memo through the diplomatic channel that Article 9 required the Dominion to keep open for me. The acknowledgement of the transmission came back in 8 minutes, which was faster than I expected, and suggested that the channel was being monitored closely. Good. The monitoring meant the memo was being read as it arrived, not queued for later processing. Hooper's response came in 37 minutes. It was 3 words. Mara, how long? I sat with the question for a moment. How long meant, how long do we have to hold on? How long meant, what are we surviving toward? I thought about the arbitration process, the panel composition requirements, the filing schedule, the response windows, the pace at which council legal proceedings moved, when the subject matter was significant enough to command full attention. 14 months, approximately, I sent back. Possibly 12 if the panel is constituted efficiently. The Article 19A recall requirement is 72 hours from invocation. That begins now. The response took several hours. When it came back, it was short. We are counting. I sent. So am I. The verification process the Dominion was conducting was not simple. I knew that because the people doing it were good at what they did. And doing it correctly required checking not just whether the protocol existed and whether its text said what I claimed it said, but also the entire chain of registered council precedents that could affect its operational status. There were no direct precedents. The protocol had never been invoked. That absence of precedent worked in my favor, because it meant the Dominion could not cite a case where the protocol had been interpreted differently than I was interpreting it. What they could do was argue about the interpretation itself, and that was an argument that would go before the panel. They would make that argument. I knew they would. I had prepared for it, but I also knew that the preparation I could do alone was limited. The argument would be sharpened in the actual proceedings, and the response to the sharpened argument would have to be developed during the proceedings. That was fine. That was how legal processes worked. You prepared what you could prepare in advance, and you developed the rest in real time. What I needed now was confirmation that the council would actually grant arbitration. Invocation is one step. The council's acceptance of the invocation is another. The Dominion could contest the invocation's validity before the council granted anything, and if the contest succeeded, the protocol was dead before it started. The Suri ambassador contacted me through the diplomatic channel 7 hours into the verification process. The message was brief and careful, written in Galactic Standard rather than Suri, which told me it had been written with an awareness that it might be read by more parties than just me. It said, "The Suri delegation has submitted an emergency panel assessment request to the Galactic Council regarding the validity of the protocol invocation in case 7841 KS. We understand you have filed the originating invocation. We are watching with interest." I read it 3 times. Then I replied, "Thank you for watching. I hope the view is instructive." The Suri had been watching the conflict between humanity and the Dominion from the beginning. They had said nothing during it, which was the pragmatic response of a species that was not powerful enough to intervene and not distant enough from Dominion authority to ignore the lesson the Dominion was demonstrating. But they had been watching, and what they had apparently decided, somewhere in the 7 hours since my invocation, was that the moment had changed enough that watching was no longer the optimal position. They filed the emergency panel assessment request before I did. I had been planning to file it directly to the council myself, but the Suri's filing was faster and carried its own weight. A request from an established, unconflicted species carries different standing than a request from the species whose invocation is being contested. The council convened a panel assessment the following morning. The assessment required determining whether the invocation met the qualifying conditions of Subclause 14, whether the compact remained operationally active under council registration, and whether there were any procedural irregularities in the invocation itself. I was called to present the case for validity. The Dominion's legal team presented the case against it. The session ran for 6 hours, and I will not describe all of it here because not all of it was interesting in ways that matter to this story. What matters is the vote. 9-3. 9 votes to grant arbitration. 3 votes against. The 3 against were all from Dominion-aligned species, and all 3 of those species were, under Article 14 status, automatically excluded from serving on the arbitration panel. Their dissent was noted in the record and had no operative effect. Arbitration was granted. The arbiter protocol was in effect. I learned of the vote in my temporary quarters on the Eternal Compact, through the Article 9 channel, 30 minutes after it occurred. I read the notification twice. Then I sat for a moment with my hands flat on the desk, not doing anything, just sitting. This is something I do sometimes at moments of significant transition. I stop moving for a brief period to let the transition settle into a real thing, rather than a thing that is still becoming real. It usually takes less than a minute. Then I picked up the tablet and I filed the first formal claim with the arbitration panel. The claim was this: the Dominion's military action had violated Article 2 of the Compact. Article 2 required the exhaustion of all available diplomatic and mediation channels before any signatory could initiate armed conflict against another signatory. The Council's mediation record showed that humanity had submitted a formal request for extended consultation when the Dominion delivered its territorial intent notification. The mediation request had been filed on a Monday. The Dominion had initiated military action the following Thursday, before the consultation period specified in the mediation process had elapsed. The war had been illegal from the beginning, not the terms of its ending, not our response to it. The war itself, from the first engagement, on day 1, had been a violation of the document that was supposed to govern the relationship between our species. I sent the filing through the panel channel. I received the acknowledgement receipt. I set the tablet down. Then I sent a second message to Hooper, through Article 9, to update the status. She wrote back in 12 minutes. Not 3 words this time. A full sentence. Tell me you have something for the colonies. I wrote back, Article 19A. 72 hours from invocation. Their occupation forces have to come back or they enter violation status and trigger sanctions from 11 species. The clock is running. Her response came in 4 minutes, also a full sentence, which I took as a sign that she was feeling something specific. How did you find it? I thought about the answer for a moment. How does a person find something they have been carrying for 11 years without knowing what it was? I read the appendix, I wrote. She sent back, of course you did. That was the closest we got to a celebration. In those first days. It was enough. The work, in those first days, had a specific character that I want to describe because it shaped everything that came after it. It was not triumphant work. The invocation had happened, and the protocol was in effect, and the verification had confirmed its validity, and the council had granted arbitration, and all of that was real and consequential. But on the other side of those events was a process that had just begun, and that would require, I knew from my knowledge of council legal timelines, a very long period of sustained effort to complete. The invocation was a door opening. What was on the other side of the door was a corridor, and the corridor was long. I spent the first 3 days after the verification doing 2 things simultaneously. The first was building the complete legal foundation for every claim I intended to make in the arbitration. Not just the arbiter protocol invocation, which was established, but the full range of compact violations I intended to pursue. The Article 2 pre-conflict violation was the most significant. The occupation conduct violations under Article 19 were well documented and straightforward. There were 3 smaller provisions I had identified that provided supporting basis for several aspects of the reparation claim, and I wanted each of them mapped completely before the panel was constituted and formal proceedings began. The second thing I was doing was writing. I was writing a document for the coordination office back on Earth, not the legal memo I had sent Hooper, which was focused on the strategic picture, but a longer, more detailed explanation of the compact structure as I had come to understand it, what it said, what it meant, why the provisions I had identified were operationally valid and not merely historical curiosities. I was writing it because I knew that the next several months were going to require more than one person's understanding of this document, and I could not be certain I was going to be the only person who needed to act on that understanding. That turned out to be the right instinct. When the coordination office sent me the team, Colin, Petra, Daniel, and Ruth, they arrived having already read the document I had written. Daniel, the law student, had annotated his copy with questions that were intelligent and specific. Ruth, the teacher, had done something that surprised me. She had created a visual diagram of the provision interconnections, drawn by hand on a large sheet of paper, showing how the articles related to each other in a web. It was not legally precise. Some of the connection lines were approximate rather than exact. But it was the right conceptual structure, and I used a version of it in every training session I ran with the team after that. We had, when the formal arbitration opened, approximately 6 weeks of preparation behind us. That was not enough. It was all we had. What it was, more precisely, was the maximum amount of preparation available to 5 people working continuously across the preparation period, which is a different thing from sufficient and also, practically, the only available standard. I told the team, in our first formal meeting before the opening session, 3 things. The first was that the case was strong. The text supported our position, the provisions were clear, and the panel's job was to apply the text, which meant that our job was to make the text impossible to misread. The second was that the opposing team was excellent and would find every available angle, and that we should expect to be genuinely challenged rather than comfortably right. The third was that the process was going to be long, and that long processes required the specific discipline of doing each step correctly rather than quickly, because errors made in the service of speed cannot always be corrected after the fact. Ruth wrote all 3 down in her notebook. I could see her writing them. She nodded after each one the way a person nods when they are not simply acknowledging information but deciding to remember it specifically. The opening session was 3 hours. The panel chair set the schedule, established the filing calendar, and gave each party an opportunity to state its position in summary form before the substantive proceedings began. The Dominion's senior advocates stated their position in careful, measured galactic standard. The protocol was dormant in a way that had affected its operational validity. The conflict had resolved the underlying situation in a way that made the arbitration moot, and the pre-conflict conduct claim was outside the proper scope of the proceeding. I stated our position. The protocol was operational. The conflict had not resolved the situation it addressed. It had created it. The pre-conflict conduct was within scope, because it was a precondition of legitimate conflict under the compact, and preconditions cannot be severed from the proceedings that arise from them. The panel chair adjourned the opening session and set the first substantive filing date for 2 weeks later. That was how it began. That was how the corridor opened. I went back to my office. I sat at the desk. I opened the compact to Article 7 and started from the beginning. And then I went back to work. The 14 months of arbitration were not glamorous. I want to be clear about that before I describe them, because the shape of a story like this one, the fall, the invocation, the clause that changed everything, creates an expectation of momentum that the reality does not match. The reality was an office on Galactic Council Station Mare that ran 3 degrees too warm, because its climate system had not been recalibrated since the previous occupant, and a coffee machine that produced something that resembled coffee in the way that a photograph of a forest resembles a forest, similar in all the measurable qualities, and missing the thing that makes it what it is. The reality was 14 months of legal work conducted in a language and a system that had not been designed with human cognitive patterns in mind, by a team of 5 people, none of whom had any previous arbitration experience. The team arrived in the 3rd week. They were sent by the reconstituted coordination office on Earth, which was operating out of a series of connected facilities in what had been a government logistics center, outside of the city of Leeds, because it had working power and a functional network connection, and someone had already been using it, and the furniture was still there. The coordination office was, at that point, approximately 37 people doing the work that had previously required 412, and they were managing it through the specific combination of necessity and improvisation that characterizes institutions in the early stages of recovering from something they were not fully equipped to survive. The 4 people they sent me were named Colin, Petra, Daniel, and Ruth. None of them were treaty lawyers. Colin had been an agricultural trade negotiator before the conflict. Petra had been a systems analyst for the Transit Authority. Daniel had been a law student in his 2nd year, which meant he was the member of the team with the most directly applicable background, though 2nd-year law students and galactic treaty arbitration have a gap between them that good intentions alone cannot close. Ruth had been a teacher. She had applied for assignment to the arbitration effort specifically because she told me in our first meeting, the kind of person who needed to be doing something useful, or she found the waiting intolerable. I liked Ruth immediately. I understood her exactly. I spent the first 3 days teaching all of them how to read the compact. Not the broad outline, they could get the broad outline from a summary document. I taught them how to read it the way the document required to be read, following the references, checking the definitions in the appendix, understanding how the provisions interconnected, learning which articles were foundational and which were dependent, and which were both. This is a skill that takes most law students a semester to develop. My team had 3 days. They were good at it. Ruth was particularly fast, which surprised me, and then did not surprise me, because a teacher's fundamental skill is learning how to learn things quickly enough to teach them. The Dominion's legal team had 8 people. They were experienced, credentialed, and had worked together for years. They knew the compact the way people know a document they wrote, which is a different kind of knowing than the kind my team and I had developed. They knew what was intended. We knew what it said. Those 2 kinds of knowing were in conflict throughout the arbitration, and the arbitration was, at its core, a 14-month argument about which kind of knowing governed. Legal documents are governed by what they say. What was intended is context for interpretation, but only when what is said is ambiguous. The critical provisions in my case were not ambiguous. The Arbiter Protocol's operational conditions were specific. The recall requirement in Article 19A was specific. The exit provision in Article 44 was specific. When the Dominion's team argued that these provisions had been written with a different context in mind, that the founders of the compact had intended them to apply differently, or in more limited circumstances than the text indicated, they were making an argument that ran directly against the text, and the text is what arbitration panels are required to apply. The Halen family delegate chaired the panel. I learned her working approach in the first session, and I built my entire practice around it. She required completeness, she required precision, and she required that every claim be supported by the specific text on which it rested, cited completely, with no paraphrase that might shift meaning. She found 3 errors in my first 3 filings. 2 were citation format issues, 1 was a genuine substantive imprecision in how I had characterized a provision, and she required corrections before she would admit the filings to the record. I corrected everything she flagged, and I thanked her each time, because she was right each time, and because an imprecise submission is a gift to the opposing team. The Dominion's first major motion was a dismissal request. They argued that the protocol had been superseded by the outcome of the military conflict, that the operative legal reality had moved past the point where a treaty provision for managing disputes could address it. The panel denied the motion unanimously. The protocol's text did not permit this argument. It explicitly addressed situations arising from completed military actions, and the panel said so in language that was unambiguous. Their second motion was a scope restriction. They argued that the protocol, even if valid, applied only to ongoing status negotiations, and not to the territorial and military dimensions of the situation. The panel denied this unanimously. The text was clear. Their third motion was to exclude the Article 2 pre-conflict violation from the arbitration's scope. This one they argued hard. They submitted a 48-page brief arguing that pre-conflict conduct was outside the arbitration's purpose, that the arbitration was meant to determine the terms of a resolution, and not to adjudicate the causes of the conflict. The panel deliberated on this for 11 days. My response brief was 31 pages. In the end, the panel denied the motion, on the grounds that Article 2's requirement for diplomatic exhaustion was a precondition of legitimate conflict under the compact, and violations of preconditions were within the scope of any proceedings arising from the conflict itself. Each denial moved something, not quickly. The pace was what the pace was, and trying to push it faster would have damaged my credibility with the panel and given the opposing team ammunition for delay motions. So I did not push. I filed when the filing windows opened. I responded to their submissions within the response periods. I let the process be what it was designed to be. Day 43. The Dominion began recalling occupation forces from Colony Worlds Brennan and Meridian 7. They did not announce this as a compact compliance action. They characterized it as a logistical reassessment of administrative priorities, which was a phrase that meant nothing specific and was designed to mean nothing specific, while describing a concrete action that everyone watching could observe. The characterization did not matter. People on Brennan and Meridian 7 watched the Dominion administrative personnel load their equipment onto transports and leave, and they called it what it was. Colin, who had been managing the colony status tracking, sent me a message when the recall confirmation came through. It was 2 words. Brennan, clear. 2 days later. Meridian 7 clear. I noted them both. I did not stop working. Day 68. The Suri filed their separate complaint regarding Dominion transit corridor pressure. The filing was precise and well documented, which told me they had been preparing it for some time. Not for this exact moment, but for a moment they had been waiting to arrive. The complaint covered 11 years of pressure tactics on 3 Suri transit lanes, supported by correspondence records that the Suri had apparently been archiving carefully, and which now became evidence in a separate proceeding before a different panel. The Dominion's legal team was now responsible for 2 sets of active proceedings simultaneously. I noted this as context rather than advantage, because my case had to be won on its own terms, and not by the Dominion's difficulty elsewhere. But context affects pace, and the response windows in my proceedings became slightly longer in the following weeks, which told me the opposing team was more stretched than they had been at the start. I kept the same pace I had been keeping. I did not accelerate or decelerate in response to their difficulty. The work was what the work was. Day 89. The colony recall had extended to 11 systems. Day 130. All occupied territories were under Provisional Council monitoring, under the protocol's protective provisions. Provisional monitoring is not full restoration. The territories were not yet formally returned to human authority, and the monitoring presence came with its own bureaucratic weight and procedural constraints. But in a monitored territory, the Dominion's unilateral authority was suspended, and the compact's terms applied, and the compact said what it said about what each party was and was not permitted to do. The Hillen families filed their complaint on Day 71, the mining rights dispute, from 3 decades prior that had been informally resolved in a way that the Hillen delegate had apparently been noting in her internal records for 30 years. 6 weeks after arbitration was granted in my case, there were 4 separate compact-related proceedings active before the Council. The Dominion had been involved in galactic legal matters before, but 4 concurrent active proceedings was not a situation their legal structure had been designed to manage comfortably. A 5th was filed on Day 94 by a small species called the Werath, whose territory lay at the far edge of the Dominion's administrative sphere, and who had been operating under a transit restriction agreement that they now argued was inconsistent with their founding compact signatory rights. The Werath had 12 representatives in their entire diplomatic corps. They filed a 7-page brief. It was a very good brief. I sent a brief note to Ruth when I saw the Werath filing come through the Council notifications. It said, "Someone else is reading." She wrote back, "Good for them." On Day 118, I received a formal request for a private meeting from Chancellor Vreth. The request came through an official channel, phrased carefully, using language that was formal without being cold. It was the language of someone who had something to discuss that they preferred to discuss outside the formal record. I declined. Through Article 9. I noted in the declination that I was willing to communicate through the official arbitration channel, as specified in the protocol's procedural requirements, and that I was available for formally recorded sessions through the panel as needed. Vreth did not send a second request. I had not expected him to. The most difficult period of the arbitration was between days 140 and 200. This was the period in which the Dominion filed their primary comprehensive argument, not a motion, but a full brief pulling every available thread into a coherent framework that challenged the fundamental validity of my case from the foundational level upward. It was the best document their team produced. It was thorough, organized, and in several places genuinely challenging. I read it over 2 days. I found 3 places where their argument was stronger than I had anticipated and required me to build new responses. I spent a week on those 3 sections. I showed the responses to Daniel and Ruth and asked them to argue against the responses as hard as they could, which they did, and which forced 2 more revisions before the responses were as strong as they needed to be. The full response brief was 47 pages. I filed it on a Wednesday morning, and then I went to the cafeteria, and I had breakfast, and I looked at the ships in the repair dock, and I thought about nothing for 45 minutes. That was the closest I came to rest in the middle months. The panel took 22 days to respond to the comprehensive filings. The response came as a procedural decision. Both parties' comprehensive arguments were admitted. A final oral session would be scheduled in 30 days, and the panel would deliver its ruling within 60 days of the final session. 60 days. After 14 months, 60 more days was a number I could hold. The oral session ran for 9 hours. Vreth did not attend. He sent his legal team's senior advocate, a formidable senior official, whose command of treaty law was impressive even from the position of someone arguing against it. I presented for humanity. Daniel sat beside me and passed me citations when I needed them, which I needed 3 times, and each time he had the right page ready before I had finished the request. We finished. The panel adjourned. 31 days later, on a Tuesday morning, the ruling came through. I was on Hartwell Station when it arrived. The lounge was small, and the chairs did not match, and there were 11 people with me, and none of us read the ruling aloud. We read it in silence, individually, at our own pace, and then we were quiet together for a while. It was everything. The full ruling, the complete relief, the precedent. Every article I had invoked, held. Every claim I had filed, sustained. The precedent, added by the panel without my request, establishing the protocol's validity for every species that might need it going forward. Everything. Someone found a bottle. It went around without ceremony. No speeches. No toasts. Just the quiet of people who have been inside something difficult for a long time and have arrived somewhere that is not yet fully real. The middle period of the arbitration, roughly months 4 through 10, had a rhythm that I settled into the way you settle into any long task that requires sustained attention. You find the structure that allows you to keep working without exhausting the specific capacity the work requires. For me, that structure was a morning reading period, 2 hours before the rest of the team arrived, when I went through whatever had arrived overnight in the panel channel or the Dominion's response filings, alone, without discussion, making notes. Then the team session, usually 4 to 6 hours, working through the day's substantive work together. Then an evening writing period, solo again, drafting or revising based on what the team session had produced. I slept 6 hours, on average, some nights less, some nights more, when the work had reached a natural pause and there was genuinely nothing to be done until something came back from the panel or from the opposing team. Those nights of more sleep were gifts. I used them. The colony restoration situation was something I tracked separately, through a channel that Hooper's office maintained with regular updates. The Article 19A recall was operating on the Dominion's compliance with the arbitration terms, and compliance was in fact occurring. Slowly, with the characterizations and framings that large institutions use when they are doing something required of them, that they would prefer to be seen as choosing rather than compelled toward, but occurring. By month 6-17 of the 23 lost systems had been formally returned to Provisional Council monitoring. By month 9, all 23. The people coming back to those worlds, The ones who had been displaced or who had been living under Dominion administrative authority for over a year were not celebrating. The mood in the updates I received was closer to cautious and exhausted than triumphant, which was the appropriate mood for people who had been through what they had been through, and who understood that the formal restoration of their status and the practical restoration of everything that had been disrupted were two different timelines. The former was happening. The latter would take years. I read those updates carefully, and then I put them aside and I worked on the case. What I could do for those worlds was to produce the strongest possible ruling, and the strongest possible ruling required that I do the work correctly and not let the weight of what was at stake make me sloppy. High stakes do not improve legal work. They are the reason to be more careful, not less. Daniel came to me in month 7 with a concern. He was the youngest member of the team, the law student, and he had developed over the months into a precise and reliable analyst who could follow a chain of treaty references as quickly as anyone I had worked with. He had also developed the quality that good legal minds eventually develop, which is the ability to see the shape of an argument rather than just its components. He came to my office in the evening, after the team session had ended, and he sat down across from me and said, "I think there is a gap in the Article 2 argument." I set down what I was working on. "Tell me," I said. He had identified a potential interpretation issue in how I had characterized the diplomatic exhaustion requirement. The Dominion's team had not yet exploited it. They had argued against the Article 2 claim on scope grounds rather than substance grounds, which was the more natural first approach. But Daniel had been thinking about what their next move might be, and he believed they had a substantive argument they had not made yet that could be stronger than their scope argument if they chose to develop it. He was right. He had found something I had looked at and not examined carefully enough, something that had seemed settled in my analysis, but that a skilled opposing team could destabilize if they approached it from the right direction. We spent 3 hours that evening working through every dimension of the potential argument and building the response. By the time we finished, the response was solid, but I would not have built it without Daniel coming to me with the concern. I told him so. He said, "You taught me to read to the end and check the footnotes." "Yes," I said. "I was checking the footnotes," he said. "Good," I said. "Keep doing that." He nodded and went back to his own office. I went back to my work. The Dominion made the argument Daniel had identified in their comprehensive brief on day 148. They had developed it well, better, in some ways, than we had anticipated, with a supporting citation chain I had not fully expected. We responded with the structure Daniel and I had built in that evening session, refined over the weeks since by the full team. The panel admitted both submissions. They did not rule on that specific point immediately. They would rule on everything at once, in the final ruling, which was the practice the Helen Chair had established at the outset and had maintained throughout. I appreciated the consistency. It meant I always knew where we were in the process. Month 11. The filing calendar was complete. Both parties had submitted everything they intended to submit. The oral session was scheduled. The end was visible, which is a specific quality of experience that long processes have when they finally approach their conclusion. Not relief, not yet, but the particular clarity of knowing exactly what remains and how long it will take. The oral session was the last time I was in a room with the Dominion's senior advocate. He was a formidable opponent, and I want to say so clearly here. In 9 hours of oral argument, he presented his team's case with precision and force, and without making mistakes that I could see. He was doing the best available version of a case that the text of the document worked against, and he did it well. If the text had been less clear, he might have prevailed. The text was what it was. I presented our case. Daniel passed me citations when I needed them, which I needed 3 times. Each time the page was ready. 9 hours. The panel adjourned. 31 days later, the ruling came through. I was sitting in the observation lounge on Hartwell Station with 11 people who had been part of this in various ways, and Owen Price, who had not been part of it but who had been present at its beginning, and we watched the ruling appear on the screen in layers. Galactic Standard first, then the other languages, one by one, until the full document was visible, and we had all read it in silence. and the room was quiet in the particular way of people who have been holding something for a very long time and have just been permitted to set it down. The bottle went around. Nobody said anything for a while. The ships in the repair dock were lit up against the dark beyond the window. I held the bottle for a moment before I drank from it. I thought about the shuttle. I thought about the appendix. I thought about the particular feeling of finding something in a document that changes what you understand to be true about the situation you are in, and not yet knowing whether it will hold, and going forward anyway because it is the only thing you have and you believe in it, and what else are you supposed to do? I drank. The bottle moved on. The room stayed quiet. It was enough. Owen Price came and sat beside me a while after the bottle had gone around. He was a quiet man, the kind of journalist who has learned over a career that silence is more productive than questions, that the thing you are looking for often arrives faster if you make space for it rather than reaching. He had been the pool correspondent at the original submission ceremony on the Eternal Compact, the only journalist present when I had walked into that chamber, and placed the compact on the table. He had sent me a message 2 weeks before the ruling asking very quietly if he could be present when it came through. I had said yes. He had arrived on Hartwell Station the day before, and in the 16 hours since his arrival he had not asked me a single question, which I respected. He sat beside me now. He looked at the screen for a while, where the text of the ruling was still displayed. Then he said, "Can I ask you something?" "You can try," I said. He thought about how to ask it. I could see him thinking, not stalling, just considering. "When you got on that shuttle," he said, "when Hooper sent you over alone to sign the submission documents, you had the book with you. Did you know then what you had? Did you know the clause was going to be able to do what it did?" I thought about how to answer honestly, not strategically, not in the way you answer a question when you know it will appear in print, but actually honestly, which required me to remember clearly what the shuttle had felt like, and not to let the shape of the 14 months since change the memory of it. "I found something," I said. "I found it on the shuttle, reading the appendix. I understood what it said. I did not know yet whether it would hold. But you invoked it anyway." "I invoked it anyway." "Why?" he said, not aggressively, just as a genuine question, the kind that a quiet journalist asks when they have made enough space for a real answer to arrive. I sat with the question for a moment. It seemed important to answer it correctly. "Because the document said what it said," I told him, "and what a document says does not stop being true because the situation around it has become inconvenient." I found a provision that applied to our situation. The provision had not been used before, but unused is not the same as invalid. It was there. It was ours to use, so I used it. I paused. And because it was the only thing I had, a person who has only one option is not particularly brave for using it. They are just not stupid. He smiled at that. He wrote something down in a small notebook that he kept in his jacket pocket. He did not tell me what he wrote, and I did not ask. He wrote a piece eventually. I read it months later, when it appeared in a publication I would not have expected to be covering galactic diplomatic proceedings, and it was a good piece, accurate, careful, not particularly dramatic, which was why it was good. The dramatic version of the story was easier to tell and less true. The truth was that what had happened in that chamber, and in the 14 months that followed, was work. Long, careful, often uncertain work, conducted by people who were not particularly extraordinary, except in the specific sense that they showed up and kept going. That is the version I want to describe here, because the other version, the one where a brilliant diplomat outwits a galactic empire with a single clause and everything resolves in a single dramatic moment, is missing the part that actually made the difference. The part that made the difference was the shuttle ride, and the footlocker, and 11 years of carrying a book that other people had stopped reading, and 400 pages of cross-referenced notes written in a temporary office on a council station that ran too warm, at hours of the night when the right thing to do would have been to sleep. The ruling changed things immediately in the ways that rulings change things, formally, procedurally, on the record. The Dominion acknowledged the ruling within 48 hours, which they were required to do under the arbitration terms. They characterized their acknowledgement as an expression of their continued commitment to the compact framework, which was the appropriate thing to say and meant exactly what it needed to mean, and no more. The withdrawal of occupation presence from the remaining monitored territories was completed within the 90-day window the ruling specified. The reparation schedule was filed with the Council payment system within the first week. The hyperlane access rights transfer was the most complex element, and took 3 months of additional negotiation to implement. But the negotiation was conducted within a framework of established obligations, rather than contested positions, which is a different and more manageable kind of negotiation. Admiral Hooper came to Hartwell Station 2 weeks after the ruling. She arrived without announcement. Her message came through 6 hours before her shuttle docked, which I later learned was her standard practice. The preference of someone who had learned over a long career that announced arrivals produce performance rather than reality. She wanted to see reality. She walked into my temporary office, looked at the desk with the 2 stacks of filed documents, and the coffee machine that was finally producing something I had calibrated to be approximately right after 4 months of adjustment. And she said, "This is where you worked." "This is where we worked," I said. The team was not there. They had been given 3 days of leave when the ruling came through, which was my doing, and which they had objected to, and which I had insisted on because there is a point past which continued effort is counterproductive even in competent people. Hooper sat down across from me. She had the cut on her jaw healed now, just a faint line remaining. She looked less like someone living through something and more like someone who had lived through something, which is a real difference. "I need to ask you something official," she said. "Ask," I said. "Earth's Coordination Office is building a Galactic Affairs division. Properly funded, properly staffed. We need someone to lead it." I looked at her. "I am retired," I said. "You were retired," she said. "There is a difference." I thought about the coffee machine. I thought about the temperature of the office. I thought about the 14 months, and whether I wanted to do 14 more months like them. Then I thought about the Werath filing their 7-page brief. I thought about the Suri ambassador's message. I thought about the 8 other proceedings that were currently active before the Council, filed in the month since the arbitration was granted, filed by species that had been watching, and had now decided that watching was no longer the right posture. All of them were working from documents they had signed and, until recently, had not read carefully enough to understand what they had signed. They needed help reading. That is a thing I can do. I will need a budget for physical document preservation, I said. Original printed copies of founding compacts degrade. They need proper housing. Hooper looked at me for a moment. "That is your condition?" "That is my first condition," I said. "I will develop further conditions as they become apparent." She almost smiled. I had known her for 14 months, and this was the closest I had seen. "Done," she said. "Send me a list when it's ready." The Galactic Affairs Division occupied, in its first year, a series of connected offices in a building that had previously housed a municipal records archive, which seemed appropriate. We had 17 people in that first year. By the third year, we had 62. By the 5th year, we had over 200, which is still not many people by the standards of what we were doing. But there is an efficiency that comes from doing something you understand well, and what we understood well was the documents. The documents. The founding compacts, the originating treaties, the registered instruments that had been filed with the Galactic Council over centuries of contact and negotiation, and the slow, complicated work of species learning to exist in proximity to each other. Most of them had been read once, carefully, when they were signed, and then treated as historical context for the rest of their existence, referenced in summaries, cited in overviews, not read, not carefully, not with the definitions checked and the cross-references followed and the appendices included. We read them, all of them, over time. We built a library of current analysis for every major document that human species was party to, and every document that affected the species that were in relationship with us. We identified provisions that had never been used and documented their operational status. We found, over the years, 7 other provisions with the character of the Arbiter Protocol. active, valid, waiting, unknown to most of the beings they were designed to protect. We told the relevant species about them. Each time, we were careful to simply present what the documents said, without advising on strategy. Because advising on strategy would have made us advocates rather than scholars, and advocates in galactic politics accrue obligations that scholars do not. We presented the text. What each species chose to do with the text was theirs. Several of them chose to do something with it. 3 active proceedings before the Galactic Council in the first 2 years after I took the position were filed by species using provisions that our division had documented and shared. All 3 were in areas where the Dominion's expansionary practices had created tensions that had not previously had a clear legal resolution mechanism. All 3 produced rulings that narrowed the scope of what the Dominion could do without triggering compact obligations. The Dominion adapted. They were not a foolish or inflexible institution. They had existed for 6 centuries by being capable of adapting when adaptation was required. And what was required now was a renegotiation of how they engaged with the smaller species around them, not from warmth or sudden generosity, but from the pragmatic recognition that the cost of the old approach had changed. When the cost of something changes, the calculation changes. When the calculation changes, behavior changes. This is how large institutions transform, slowly and without drama, through the accumulated weight of changed calculations. It is slower than anyone wants it to be. It is less clean than the story of a single clause changing everything would suggest. The galaxy is complicated, and complicated things change in complicated ways. And patience is not a quality that comes naturally to beings who have been defeated and are trying to rebuild what was taken from them. I thought about patience a great deal in the years after the ruling. I thought about the 14 months and the 400 pages of notes and the coffee machine that was never quite right until month 4, and I thought about what it means to stay inside a process that moves slowly when everything in you wants it to move faster. I had learned it on the shuttle, in a specific way that I had not learned it before. The shuttle had given me something that 11 years of carrying the book had not. The understanding that the thing in the book was real, and that making it real required the slow work of doing each step correctly, and not skipping forward. You cannot skip forward in a legal proceeding. You cannot invoke a clause and have it resolve in an afternoon. You invoke the clause, and then you do the work, and then you wait for the work to produce what it produces, and then you do more work in response to what it produces, and eventually, after long enough, the structure you have built is standing, and the ruling is on the screen, and the bottle is going around, and you have done what you set out to do. The Suri ambassador sent me a message 8 months after the ruling. We had been corresponding intermittently since then, carefully, through channels appropriate to the relationship between our respective positions. The message was informal, sent to a personal address rather than an official one. It said, "We have been reading. We found 3 provisions we had not previously known were active. We are deciding what to do with them." I wrote back, "Take your time. Correct analysis is worth the patience required to complete it." She sent back, "You sound like someone who read a document on a shuttle." I sent back, "I am someone who read a document on a shuttle. It is the most specific thing I know how to be." The old gray book is in a preservation case now. The Council Historical Office sent a specialist to assess its condition, and the assessment concluded that the physical copy had been subjected to substantial handling stress over its life, but remained fully legible and structurally intact, and that with proper housing, it could remain in usable condition for the foreseeable future. The specialist was very careful about it, handling it with the specific attention that people give to things that have become larger than themselves. I watched the specialist handle it, and I thought about the footlocker it had lived in for 11 years, and the shuttle seat it had rested on, and the desk in the storage room on the Aldrich where I had finished packing my bag. I thought about how small an object it was, and how many times it had been in rooms where no one knew it was there, and how it had remained exactly itself throughout all of that. The same words, the same provisions, the same weight of what was written down, waiting without urgency for the moment when it would become necessary. Documents wait. They do not have urgency. They do not know what decade it is, or how many times they have been put down and picked up, or whether the situation they were written to address has become complicated by 18 months of military conflict. They simply remain. They say what they say. They mean what they mean. And if you read them carefully enough, at exactly the moment you need to understand what they mean, they are there, unchanged, saying it. That is the thing the Dominion forgot. That is the thing, I think, that large and powerful institutions most often forget about the documents they sign. The documents do not forget. They do not become historical. They do not stop being operative, because nobody has looked at them in decades. They wait, patient and precise, for the moment when someone needs them and has read them carefully enough to know what they say. The galaxy is different now than it was on the day I got on that shuttle. Not transformed. The galaxy does not transform. But different in the specific way that happens when a balance of assumptions shifts, when beings who have been operating on certain premises about what is and is not possible look at their premises and find them revised. The Dominion is different. The smaller species are different. The relationship between what is written down and what actually governs behavior is different. Because the species who had signed documents they had not read carefully enough now know that the documents are operational, and knowing that has changed how they think about what they signed. This is the slow work, the patient work, the work of reading things to the end, and following the references, and checking the definitions, and staying inside the process, until the process produces what the process is designed to produce. It is not glamorous work. It is not fast work. It is, I have come to believe, the most important work available to beings who are trying to make a complicated galaxy function in ways that are fair to the beings living in it. I think about the 14 people in the lecture hall on New Lisbon and the maintenance robot in the back row. I think about the papers I wrote that 17 people read. I think about the students who sat through my classes and found the compact historically interesting in the mild way that you find things historically interesting when they do not seem immediately relevant to anything. I wonder how many of them, in the years since the ruling, have pulled out their notes from those classes and read them again. I wonder if any of them have found something in those notes that they had not noticed the first time. I hope they have. I hope they read to the end. I hope they check the footnotes and follow the cross-references, and do not stop before the appendix. The appendix is where the definitions are. The definitions are where everything that matters actually lives. Read the whole thing, every time. Even when the proceeding is already over and the ruling is already on the screen, and the bottle has already gone around and you are sitting in a room on a station, looking out at ships being rebuilt, and thinking that the work is done. The work is not done. The work is what comes next. The next document. The next provision. The next moment when a being somewhere reads something carefully enough to understand what it actually says, and uses what it says, and produces a change that would not have happened if they had stopped before the appendix. That is the job. That is what I do. That is, if I am honest, what I have always done. Read things to the end. Follow the references. Stay with the document until I understand it completely, rather than settling for the version that everyone else found sufficient. It is an annoying quality. Several of my colleagues have told me so over the years, and they were not wrong. It is not convenient. It is not fast. It makes you the kind of person who cannot let things rest until they are fully resolved, who checks the footnotes when everyone else has moved on, who carries a book in a footlocker for 11 years because the work it represents does not feel finished yet. But it finds things. It finds the clause in the appendix, and the provision in the subsection, and the word in the definition schedule that changes everything. It finds the thing that was there all along, waiting, saying what it said, patient in the way that written things are patient, because they have no choice but to wait. I found it because I read the whole thing. Next time, the whole galaxy will know to read the whole thing. That will have to be enough. It is more than enough.